It's a distinct privilege for me right now to be sitting here next to General John Hyten and spend the last part of this innovation summit, the closing chapter that kind of bookends the session that Kim Kreider led this morning, where we talked about the value of people, the importance of people, whether they're enlisted officers, guardians, how it's important for them to be passionate about what they do, how it's important for them to have a kind of a disruptive gene, be willing to do something different, be willing to fail. In industry, we talk about it's okay to fail early, fail often, and then move on, learn from it and move on. That has not been recently, last 30 or 40 years, that's not been the mantra in DOD. And I think it's a very, one of the privileges is to be here with General John Hyten, who is a significantly innovative thought leader, constructive disruptor, unafraid to challenge the status quo, unafraid to embrace new technologies, unafraid, even though we have a very proud and distinguished acquisition system, it's predicated on a process of invention. And now that we have technology leadership in many areas, in the private sector, moving fast, agile development processes, agile funding techniques. Some of the best and brightest are engaged in that. We have to move and adapt an acquisition system that is predicated on invention and move toward one that's able to adapt and operate and exploit the technology leadership that so often is right here at home, right here in America, that we can take advantage of it for our young men and women in uniform. So that's a privilege. By way of introduction, General Hyten obviously served as the 11th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. That's the second highest military position in the country. He commanded at the squadron, the group, the wing, and the major command levels. In 2006, he deployed to Southwest Asia as director of the Space Force for operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. He commanded Air Force Space Command and previously was the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, one of 11 combatant commands under the Department of Defense. He has a variety of awards, decorations, and achievements. I won't list them all. I don't think we have time to list them all, but involves the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Air Force Commendation Medal, Army Commendation Medal, Joint Staff Achievement Medal, Air Force Achievement Medal. I think you get my point. There's a lot. And I got to tell you what, from my personal experience, he deserved more. So with that, I will say that he began his career in engineering and acquisition, which is important because I think when you ground yourself in technology and engineering discipline, it pays rewards your whole life. It has for me. So today, of course, General Hyten serves as advisor to Blue Origin and leads the Club of the Future, which is the Blue Origin space-focused educational nonprofit inspiring young leaders of tomorrow to enter the space economy. In March of this year, he was also appointed as special advisor to the C3 AI CEO, Thomas Siebel. And of course, he has a bachelor's degree from Harvard. He has a master's in business administration from Auburn. So, John, welcome. It's obviously, I'm a little excited and passionate. So it's just a pleasure to have you here.
I appreciate that. All that stuff means I'm old.
And accomplished.
No.
But your service has been remarkable. We're going to, as I mentioned before, we kicked this Space Innovation Summit off, and it is a privilege for Comtech to sponsor it because we culturally are aligned with the themes of this conference, and that is it's about people. It's about our guardians. It's about our enlisted people. It's about our officers. In industry, it stretches the same way. It's not just across executive leadership, but it's all the way down to that innovator on the factory floor that's making things happen, challenging the status quo, and inviting us to do things different. So let me pose a question. You've had an incredible career. Maybe you can share a little of your experiences with regard to the origins of the Space Force, how it came about, one or two of your most memorable moments, and please weave the people part into that.
You bet. Absolutely. So thanks very much, Ken. I do appreciate the introduction, even though it was a little long. I still do appreciate it. Thank you. People call me a disruptor all the time and an innovator. I actually don't think of myself as that. I always thought of myself as somebody who studied the threat every day and tried to figure out how the United States should stay ahead of the threat. And many of the things we were doing did not respond to that threat. And therefore, it was critical that we move in a different direction and move fast, not because I just want to disrupt the system. It's because the way we were structured didn't respond to the threat. So we had to move unbelievably fast in order to do that. And oh, by the way, the Space Force the last 3 years has started to move at pace. The acquisition process is still moving too slow from my perspective. We still basically have the same overhead architecture we did 15 years ago. That has got to change. But my memories about the Space Force come from that same perspective, is that you look at our adversaries, and our big adversaries are Russia and China, lesser adversaries in North Korea and Iran. Who knows where the next adversary is going to come from? But you have to look across the world and say, are we postured as a military to effectively respond to that? And if you look at what China and Russia in particular are doing in space, we were not ready for a conflict in space. And the scary part is, if you're not ready for a conflict, conflict's liable to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The best way to avoid conflict, whether it's Caesar or George Washington, the best way to avoid war is to prepare for war. And you need to be prepared for it. And we need to be prepared in all domains. And we need to be prepared in space, and we weren't. And I guess my biggest memory of the creation of the Space Force was I was a brand new commander of Strategic Command in late 2016, speaking to the House Armed Services Committee, the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, which was Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama and Congressman Jim Cooper of Tennessee,
Mm-hmm.
Republican and Democrat. And they had been talking to me all year about, we're not ready. And I remember Mike Rogers had built this chart, and the chart had 64 faces on it. And in the hearing, he holds up the chart with the 64 faces and goes, these are the people who are in charge of space, all 64 of them. So I don't know who the heck's in charge of space. We need to fix that. And so, I mean, in a public hearing, you say certain things, and then you close the door in a private session and you start walking through it. And in that private session, I raised the concept, and I called it a Space Corps in that private session, because I really liked the way the Department of the Navy was structured, with the Naval Service, the Navy, and the Marine Corps underneath it. And I thought that was a model that deserved interest. And we walked through the pros and cons of that. We walked through a separate service. We walked through an embedded service in the Air Force. We walked through all those things. And finally, they looked at me and said, could you just write it down? Could you just write down this conversation and send it to us? So I said, sure, easy. I mean, I always consider myself a good writer. But what I failed to realize that 4-stars don't write much anymore. And so I go home, it's Christmas time. My wife, who's sitting over to the side, I said, I just have to jot down a paper real quick. Well, it took me the entire Christmas break. I was going backwards and forwards, trying to make sure I had it right. And then I finished that paper and I sent it to the House of Representatives, and Rogers and Cooper took it and started running with it. And that was probably the most memorable piece, because that's kind of where it started, and everything kind of spun off of that. But I give Mike Rogers and Jim Cooper the big, kudos for taking that and running with it, because ultimately, creation of a separate service, you can't get a much bigger political decision than that.
But it starts with a conversation between people with a common objective, willing to listen to each other, willing to throw something out that might be right or might be wrong, and talk about it, right?
Well, I think it's important not just to emphasize that, but also to emphasize their political backgrounds. Mike Rogers from Alabama, about as conservative as we can get. Jim Cooper on the other side of the aisle. So you have a Democrat and a Republican who have very different political followings, political backers, political persuasions, political ideals, except when they sit down and they look at what is important for the security of this country, which is important to everybody, they put aside all the differences and said, we're going to move together forward into the future to make sure that we're structured correctly. And, in today's day and age, that doesn't happen very often. So that's another reason they deserve a lot of credit. But you have to have a group of people sit down and argue about things and fight about things. And, and I tell you what, it's best done behind closed doors, where you can scream a little bit and argue a little bit and take a whiteboard and start writing things down and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then actually taking pen to paper and writing things down is unbelievably important, because when the written word is in front of you, you have to respond to the written word. And what I forgot about when I was writing it is, when you write it down, it's got to be right. You can't have nuances. You can't have uncertainties. You have to say, Space Force, Space Corps, Space Command, Space Structure. These are the pros, the cons, and everything that come with that. Because if you don't, then you won't have a full debate when the actual verbal debate happens.
I'm going to highlight a point you made earlier, and maybe it was a nuance, but I think it's significant, is in the conversation you had with those political leaders, there was diversity of background, diversity of thought, diversity of decision calculus, diversity of all those things. And in many ways, that's where some of the emotion sometimes bubbles up, because we came from different places. But the fact is, in my view, diversity isn't a social agenda. Diversity is a outcome. It's results driven. Okay. Diversity simply creates a better outcome because it brings more perspective. It creates a hotter debate. It creates a more intense debate. And then you're right. When you write it down, all of a sudden now, whether you come from diversity of background over A, B, or C, when you read that, it has to mean the same thing to you.
Yeah. But I had a great reminder this morning. So all morning long this morning, Laura and I spent with my command chief when I was a wing commander at Schriever Air Force Base, 2005, Chief Master Sergeant retired, Russ Cook. And I tell you, Chief Cook has been through some tough medical challenges, and he's doing pretty darn good. And he drove all the way in from Frederick, Maryland to just hang out with us all day, play a little golf, have some lunch, just talk. And God, he just brought back so many memories, and he brought back an important memory to me. And that memory was, and today we're going to recognize a lot of amazing officers, and you've heard a lot of amazing officers today as we've gone through it. But the enlisted force, I think Kim Kreider talked about the enlisted force this morning. Mm-hmm. The enlisted force that does space for this country is so remarkable, just so remarkable. And Chief Cook led them. I mean, when I was the wing commander, the average age of the operator on GPS was somewhere between 23 and 24 years old. And the guys actually operating the satellite were 19 to 20 years old. GPS for the entire world comes from a 19-year-old airman at the time, now Guardian, mostly on his first assignment, just out of tech school, that sits down every day. And I remember one of my greatest moments, General Chilton was coming out. I was a colonel. He was the 4-star. General Chilton comes out to visit. And, I learned from General Chilton and everybody else, but when you're a 4-star and you're walking around, when you walk up to an airman, you go, so, hey, how are you? So who are you? Where are you from? Right. And the airman stands right up at attention, sharp as a tack, says his name, says where he's from. And General Chilton then goes, so what do you do? And one of the proudest moments of my life, because that airman stood up to that 4-star and he said, General, from this terminal right here, I create combat effects everywhere in the world. And General Chilton goes, oh my gosh, that's amazing. But that 19-year-old kid got it.
Knew exactly what.
Not that 19-year-old man.
Knew his job.
He knew his job. He knew what he was doing. It was spectacular. And then it just flashed back to all the lessons the enlisted force taught me. Maybe the greatest lesson of my life was when I was a squadron commander. My leadership lesson of my life was when I was a squadron commander. And I never thought I was going to be a squadron commander. Honestly, I never did. I was an engineer, right? Transitioned late into space operations. There's no way I can be a squadron commander. And there I am, squadron commander. So, man, I'm going to get this done, and I'm going to get this done right. And we're going to have the best squadron in the world. And I was just working myself to death. I was in the op center on mid shifts. I was in the dorms on weekends. I was wherever it had to be. That's where I was. And I had 250, airmen in my squadron. 100 of them were first-term airmen. And I tell you what, 100 first-term airmen can do some crazy stuff. And I just couldn't get through to them. And I was trying everything I could. I knew everybody's name. I knew everybody's story. I knew everybody's structure. And I could talk to everybody. And so finally, one day I'm in a big meeting, and it doesn't go very well. And I walk back to my office, and the 3 senior NCOs of the organization, Robbie Robinson, who was chief of plans, Bill Brokel, who was the ops superintendent, Jim Patton, who was the maintenance superintendent. And they walk up to my office and they knock on the door and said, sir, can we talk to you? And they walk in, and I say, so what's up? And they say, sir, we can see you're upset. And the mission was going well, right? I just couldn't get through to the airmen. And they look at me and they go, sir, why are you upset? And I said, gosh, I'm trying everything I can do. And I go through the litany of all the things I'm doing. and I just can't get through to the airmen. And they look at me in the eye and they go, "Sir, did you ever think of just asking us?" Because it's actually not your job to take care of the airmen. It's our job to take care of the airmen. If you would just be our squadron commander and tell us what you want to do with the airmen, we'll do it. And I go, oh my gosh, I missed the most important thing. And from that point forward, two amazing things happened. Number one, I committed to myself that I would never do anybody else's job. If I wanted something done, I would tell people what to do. If I needed to tell them twice, I'd tell them twice. If I need to tell them 3 times, I'd tell them 3 times. After that, I'd find somebody else. If I couldn't get it done, I would just keep pressing. But if you actually empower people to do the job and give them the authority and responsibility, they will run. They will run and they will not stop. It's the most amazing thing you've ever seen. And the other amazing thing happened is that for the first time, I started getting home for dinner with my family every night.
Well, not every night.
No, every night.
Really?
I'd get home with my family because somebody else's job was to take care of it. Now, when we had, Desert Fox and, the various desert operations, and when we had wartime things, that's a different issue. But if it's a regular day, I'd be home for dinner. And I took that all the way through Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It doesn't always work. And I do cheat as a 4-star because you have a skiff at the house. But oh my gosh, it's amazing. If you empower people, they will just blow you away, especially the Guardians and Airmen and the Air and Space Force.
That's fantastic. I'm going to go back to last year. You helped host last year's Space Innovation Summit. We had Sir Richard Branson there.
Yeah.
The two of you had a conversation. You spoke a lot on what we got right regarding the Space Force. Perhaps now, as you reflect a little bit longer distance, what can you say with respect to that and some of the biggest achievements of what we got right? So
what we got right, and I think General Raymond, and we're going to get to tell some General Raymond stories tonight. Jay Raymond, D.T. Thompson, Nina Armagno, Chance Saltzman, Stephen Whiting, John Shaw. That leadership team was the perfect leadership team at the right time. And part of me always wishes I could be part of it because I was the vice chairman while I was Stratcom, then I was the vice chairman. So I was joint and I could watch them and watch what they were doing, and I could encourage them and help them, but it was there to do. But the other part of me realizes that I shouldn't have been there because it was their time, and they knew it was their time, and they stepped up and did it. And General Raymond did, gosh, I wouldn't want to go through the stuff he went through. He had to create, the service. He had to create the uniforms. He had to create the song. He had to create, everything. God, what a nightmare. And you have to focus on warfighting at the same time, and he did that. But he set the stage for General Saltzman to come in as the chief and to be totally set after only 2 years to focus on the warfighting problem in space. Because if we're going to deter conflict in space, you got to focus on the warfighting problem. And that's the structure that they created. So on the warfighting side of the house, at all of the operational bases, it's leveraged all the way down to the youngest Guardian. And it's amazing because you talk to the youngest Guardian, and I got to do it last summer at a number of the Space Force bases, probably all of them except Vandenberg. I think all of them except Vandenberg. And I would talk to the youngest Guardian, and they all had it. They all knew exactly what they were supposed to do. That message from the chief had pressured all the way down through it, and it was perfect. But in different segments of the acquisition element, that did not transmit all the way down. And there's a logical reason for that, is that you can talk all you want about innovation and moving fast and doing acquisition different in space. But if you have to plug into a Defense Department bureaucracy that expects things certain ways, you have to bring it in that way or you don't get through, period. And so that stifles innovation moving down, because the acquisition professionals that are out there naturally fight against it, because they understand if they don't figure out how to plug into the Defense Department bureaucracy, they don't get through. And so you can change an element of the acquisition bureaucracy, but if you don't leverage all the way down and empower the people to do it, nothing changes. And I think I told the story to Richard Branson last year, but as an operator for the last 30 years, it's amazing how the nation will give me authorities to take human life as a commander. That's a pretty daunting responsibility. The nation will give me the authority to manage the entire nuclear arsenal of this country. But they won't give a colonel in Los Angeles the ability to make a decision to buy something. They won't give a 3-star in Los Angeles the authority to make a decision to buy something. That authority is held in committees in the Pentagon, and that 3-star, that colonel has to come all the way up through the bureaucracy to do anything. And one of my favorite stories at Stratcom, and it's going to take a minute, I think we have enough time, but when I became the commander of Stratcom, I'll just say I didn't grow up in the nuclear world. I spent time in the nuclear world. I studied the nuclear world. I certainly launched Minutemen. I launched Peacekeepers. But I was not steeped in the nuclear tradition. So now I'm the commander of Strategic Command, the nuclear command of the country, the most powerful command in the world, and there's no second. Actually, there is a second, but it's distant. Even in Russia, even in China, Strategic Command has everything underneath it. And so I'm the commander, and one of the first things I do, I had a senior advisory group that came, and gosh, the people around the table just blew you away. Rich Meese, Admiral Rich Meese, former commander of Strategic Command, Larry Welch, former SINCSAC, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force. You just go around the table, and it's lab directors, just an amazing group of people. But the first one that we held, Johnny Foster, former director of Livermore, and also importantly for this story, former DDR&E in the Pentagon in the 60s, came, and he hadn't come in a decade. And he's 94 years old, and he shows up. And I asked Admiral Meese, why is Dr. Foster coming? Because I never met him. He's a hero of mine. I got to meet him, which was awesome. But Admiral Meese goes, he's just curious about you, because he's heard strange things and he wants to see it for himself. So we start going through it, and I explain my vision. I explain how we're going to go. We got to go faster. All the things that you've heard, all the things you said earlier. And all of a sudden, it strikes me that Dr. Foster was DDR&E when General Schriever was building Minuteman, and Admiral Rickover was building Polaris Poseidon.
Couple of innovators,
right? And so it just flashed on me. And we were talking about the need to go fast, the struggle with going fast. And all of a sudden I look over at Johnny Foster and I say, Dr. Foster, so you were DDR&E back in the 60s. That meant you were the boss of Admiral Rickover and General Schriever. How did you manage those guys? Right. And he leans back and he cackles, just the funniest laugh. He's 94 years old. He's cackling. And all of a sudden he goes, it was actually pretty easy. Because back in the 60s, I had a staff of 100 people that ran everything. Right. And then I have these powerful 4-stars that have the ear of the president of the United States. And I got to figure out how to manage them. So what I did is every month I picked up the phone. I called out and I said, Hyman, how are you? Benny, how are you? How's the family? How are the kids? Doing good? And then he'd go, you need me to do anything? And they'd go, no, Johnny, we're good. All right, thanks very much. Talk to you next month. Hang up the phone. Then he said, like every third month, he'd call him up and they said, man, Johnny, we got a problem with the White House. We got a problem with the Senate. We got a problem with Congressman X. Could you just solve that problem? And Johnny said, I got something to do. So I go work that problem. I work that problem until it's done. When it's done, I pick up the phone. I call, Benny, problem solved. Anything else? No, Johnny, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Click. That's oversight in the 60s, right? Think about what would happen today and the levels of bureaucracy you'd have to go through and the levels of bureaucracy you have to go up. There's no way to move fast. But that's how Schriever built Minuteman in 5 years, 800 deployed. And he had to invent all the technology, all the command and control, all the holes in the ground, all the roads across the Midwest, everything. That's how Rickover and created a submarine in the same amount of time that took a nuclear reactor the size of this building, squeezed it into a 20-foot submarine, and steamed around the world under nuclear power and never surfaced in 5 years. Imagine trying to do that today. So the key is empowering people. That's what Chief Cook reminded me of this morning. Empower people and they will do amazing things.
Fantastic. A lot of lessons in there, a lot of lessons to unpack in there. Coming back to people. At last year's Space Innovation Summit, you mentioned the need to develop joint space officers. Okay. Folks that can work across land, sea, air, and space domains. Can we revisit that this year and maybe talk about your view on that now, the progress we're making, and how that applies to things like JADC2?
Yeah, so I was listening to John Olson talk about JADC2. I always like it when John talks about it because he actually gets it. JADC2 is nothing more than the ability to move data to the right place at the right time, give it to the right person, and put it in decision quality so they can do something with it. That's all JADC2 is. And I tell you, a lot of people make it way too complicated. But the ability to move data in today's world is unbelievably difficult. We have so much proprietary data, so much data that cuts off. We just don't make the data available for us. No, by the way, that doesn't mean we have to own the data, but all the data have to be available. So when we wrote the joint requirements for the joint warfighting concept, the 4 supporting concepts, in each of those concepts is the following statement: from this point forward, all data will be made available, period. And I hope to high heaven that the men and women in J8 and in the Joint Staff are holding the services accountable for that, because and notice it says be made available. It doesn't say the Department of Defense from this day forward will own all the data. And that should empower and enable our contractors to deliver the kind of capabilities we need, but they can't cut the data off from what we have. We have to figure out how to share that. And that's how we're going to do JADC2. That's how we're going to get to joint space operations. And that's how we're going to integrate space with the joint warfighting architecture. So that structure has got to be pursued and driven from the top. But the JROC's job is to do joint requirements, not service requirements. The JROC's job is to make sure that all the space capabilities integrate with all the other services. But it's not to define the space capabilities of the future or the air capabilities of the future. That's not the job. And that's in Title 10, that's in law. And we forget that sometimes.
All right, I'm going to push the envelope here because we're running out of time, but I got to ask one more question because we're honoring General J. Raymond this afternoon with a leadership award that bears your name. Give me one quick General J. Raymond story.
So first of all, that's just weird that my name's on something. It's doubly weird that J. Raymond would get something, but I like the fact that he's going to take it on behalf of the entire Space Force. That actually makes it okay with me, but it's hard to get over the weird part. It really is. But here's my favorite J. Raymond story, because J. Raymond is a good friend of mine. But at one point in my life, he was my best friend. My best friend. And that was because he was going to replace me in theater. So as the director of Space Forces, I was there, from early May to October of 2006. And I can tell you, he became Laura's best friend too, because as soon as Jay could get there, I could leave. Right? So I keep talking to Jay. Jay, you're my best friend, man. You got to get here. You got to get here. And sure enough, here he is on the plane. He lands. But General North, who was the CFAC at the time, had a requirement for the Aerospace 4 coming in that I had to take Jay all the way through theater to meet all the Army Space Support Teams in Fallujah, Ramadi, the Marine Space Support Teams, Fallujah, Ramadi, the armies in Baghdad, up in Bagram, and all over the theater, Afghanistan, Iraq. I had to take him through. Now, the problem for me is wherever I go, I break airplanes. So if you ever see me in an airport and you're getting on the same plane, just go ahead and get another ticket because it's not going to work out well for you. So I was famous in theater for breaking planes. I took battle damage going into Bagram one time, one single bullet hole in the bottom, but it was the only plane. And if there's one bullet, you can't fly it until somebody comes up and checks the airplane. So I got no way out. So I'm stuck. And sure enough, I fly with Jay and we get stuck. We get stuck and we can't get out. So finally we come back down and we're stuck again. And finally, I just go to Jay and I said, hey, man, we've known each other a long time. Here's the deal. I'm leaving. You got it, bud. And he looks at me and goes, well, we haven't been to X, Y, and Z. I said, I'll talk to General North. And oh, by the way, Tom James is sitting right here, the Army deputy, who is still doing great things in the space business. If you just trust that guy, you'll be fine.
It'll be okay.
And he was. So I didn't do Jay quite right, but he did me right because he got me home to my family.
Been a pleasure. Thank you for your time today. We're going to enjoy a nice reception tonight.
Yeah.
And it's been a pleasure.
Thanks,
Talking
Ken.
to you.
It was fun talking to you too. Thanks
All right.
so much.
Thank you.